Like that.
There's a $4 million car sitting dead on the showroom floor of America's most prestigious automotive company, and 11 of the best engineers in the country cannot explain why. The unveiling is in 4 days. The press is already booked. The investors are already watching. CEO Vivian Mercer has spent 12 years clawing her way to the top of an industry that never wanted her there, and now the crown jewel of everything she has built refuses to start. Then a delivery driver in a faded work jacket sets down his clipboard and asks one quiet question. The room laughs. They shouldn't have. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The Apex Falcon had never been driven on a public road. It had been designed in secret, built in secret, and transported to the Sterling Automotive headquarters in Detroit under a black canvas tarp on a flatbed truck at 2 in the morning, 3 weeks before anyone outside the company was supposed to know it existed. The engineers who built it called it, among themselves, the most technically sophisticated automobile ever assembled on American soil. The PR department had a different name for it, the Future. The board of directors had a simpler name still, the $4 million answer to every analyst who had spent the last 3 years writing obituaries for Sterling Automotive. The showroom where it now sat, silent, unmoving, draped in a second canvas tarp while technicians argued around it, occupied the entire ground floor of the Sterling headquarters building on East Jefferson Avenue. The floor was polished white concrete. The lighting was the kind of recessed, indirect track lighting that made everything look like an Apple store. There were scale models of Sterling's greatest cars mounted on pedestals along the north wall, stretching back 60 years. The 1962 Sterling Continental, the 1978 Prescott GT, the 1991 Monarch Coupe, a legacy arranged in chronological order, leading the eye inevitably toward the back of the room where the Apex Falcon sat beneath its cover like something sleeping. Vivian Mercer arrived at 6:14 in the morning on the third day. She wore the same charcoal blazer she'd worn the day before. Her assistant, a 24-year-old named Priya, who had the unfortunate job of delivering bad news at regular intervals, met her at the elevator with a coffee she hadn't asked for and a tablet displaying a summary she didn't want to read. "Marcus says they're no closer," Priya said. "You already told me that last night." "He wanted me to tell you again, in case you'd forgotten." Vivian took the coffee. "What about Harmon? Did he fly in?" "Landed at 11. He's been in there since midnight. Dr. Elliot Harmon was not a man you called unless everything else had failed. He had a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT, a second one in systems diagnostics from Carnegie Mellon, and a consulting rate that made CFOs physically wince when they saw the invoice. Vivian had authorized his fee at 10 o'clock the previous morning without blinking, which told everyone on her executive team something about how serious the situation had become. Vivian Mercer did not spend money impulsively. Vivian Mercer did not do anything impulsively. She pushed through the double-glass doors into the showroom. The scene that greeted her was controlled chaos in the specific way that only very expensive, very professional chaos can be. There were 11 people gathered around the Apex Falcon, which had been uncovered and was sitting under the full glare of the showroom lights like a patient on an operating table. It was a stunning machine even in distress, low and wide, with a body sculpted from aerospace-grade carbon fiber in a deep, almost black shade of midnight blue that shifted toward purple in certain light. The hood was up. 3 diagnostic laptops were open on rolling carts nearby. 2 engineers were crouched at the front wheel wells. Harmon stood at the rear of the car with a printout in one hand and a thermos in the other, frowning at something no one else could apparently see. No one looked up when Vivian walked in. She appreciated that about engineers. They tended not to perform awareness of authority figures when something was actually broken. It was one of the few things she found genuinely relaxing about spending time with them. "Elliot," she said. Harmon looked up. He was 61, with white hair cut military short and a face that had the weathered quality of someone who spent a lot of time thinking very hard. "Miss Mercer, tell me something useful." He set the thermos down on the rolling cart beside the nearest laptop. "I can tell you a number of things. None of them are useful. Try anyway. The engine architecture is unlike anything I've seen in series production. Whoever designed the base system was working about 10 years ahead of current industry standards. The fuel injection sequencing alone, he stopped. That's not what you want to hear. No. What I can tell you is that every diagnostic we run comes back clean. The computer says the car is fine. The car disagrees. We cannot find a single component that is registering a fault. Vivian looked at the open hood. The engine compartment of the Apex Falcon was an exercise in beautiful precision. Everything laid out in a logic that almost felt intentional, like the inside of a watch. She had looked at a lot of engines in her career, enough to know the difference between a good one and a great one, but she was not an engineer. She knew what she was looking at the same way a person who loved music but couldn't play an instrument knew what they were listening to. 3 days, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 days, Harmon confirmed. The unveiling is Saturday. I'm aware. She turned and looked at Marcus Webb, her chief of engineering operations, who was standing near the diagnostic carts with his arms crossed and the specific expression of a man who had not slept in 72 hours and was starting to lose his tolerance for being looked at. Marcus was 44, good at his job, and deeply unhappy at this particular moment. What about the secondary ECU? Vivian asked him. Swapped it out yesterday morning. No change. Fuel pressure? Normal. Ignition timing? We've checked it 6 times. Check it a 7th. Vivian, I'm not asking you to do it personally, Marcus. I'm asking you to assign someone to do it again. He uncrossed his arms. Fine. She walked the perimeter of the car slowly, not touching it, just looking. The Apex Falcon had been 3 years in development. It was the centerpiece of a company turnaround strategy that she had personally designed and sold to the board after 2 consecutive years of declining market share, 3 executive departures, and 1 very public quality control scandal involving the Sterling Regent's brake system that had cost the company $340 million in settlements and approximately all of its remaining credibility in the luxury segment. The Apex Falcon was supposed to be proof that Sterling was done apologizing. It was supposed to be the beginning of something. At the moment, it was a very expensive paperweight. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it. What about the fuel injectors themselves? She asked. 3rd-generation piezoelectric, custom manufactured, Harmon said. We've individually bench-tested each one. They're all within spec. The spark plugs. Replaced. Twice. The battery? 2 batteries, both new. Vivian stopped at the front of the car and looked at the engine. Something about Harmon's description of the base system design nagged at her. The comment about it being 10 years ahead of current standards. She had heard something like that before, in a different context. She couldn't place it. Where did the engine architecture come from? She asked. Whose design? Marcus and Harmon exchanged a look that lasted slightly too long. The foundational work was done internally, Marcus said carefully. Years ago, before my time here. Whose name is on the original design documents? I'd have to pull the files. Pull them. He nodded and moved away, and she could tell by the way he moved that he was relieved to have something specific to do. The delivery came at 10:20. It was not an unusual delivery. 3 crates of replacement diagnostic components that Harmon had overnighted from a supplier in Ohio, standard procedure when you were running out of parts to try. The crates came through the service entrance at the back of the building on a hand truck operated by a man in a brown work uniform who signed the intake form without making eye contact with the assistant who handed it to him, and then stood in the doorway of the showroom for a moment, squinting at the Apex Falcon. The way a person squints at something they recognize from a long time ago. His name badge said Nathan. He was 46 years old, medium height, with the kind of hands that belonged to someone who worked with them. Broad across the knuckles, marked with old scars, permanently stained at the cuticles with something that no amount of washing had ever quite removed. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that was not unhandsome but had clearly been through a few things. He had the specific quality of stillness that some people develop after spending many years being very quiet in rooms where they were not particularly wanted. He stood in the doorway for no more than 10 seconds. Then he turned and left. The assistant collected the crates and brought them to Harmon's cart, and nobody thought about the delivery driver again for another 40 minutes, When he reappeared at the service entrance with a second-hand truck and a form indicating that there had been a scanning error on the original intake, and would someone please sign the corrected version? Vivian was standing near the diagnostic carts when he came back in, reading the report Marcus had finally pulled up on his tablet. The original design documentation for the engine architecture, which turned out to be 14 years old and attributed to an engineering team that, as far as she could tell, no longer existed at Sterling. She didn't look up when Nathan walked in. He signed the corrected intake form. He started to leave. Then he stopped. He stood looking at the open engine compartment for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not quite recognition, not quite something else. Something that lived between those two things. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "May I take a look under the hood?" The room didn't quite go silent, but it changed. It was the particular change of a room full of people who have all heard the same thing and are collectively deciding how to respond. Marcus turned around first. He looked at Nathan the way he might look at someone who had just made an inadvisable joke at a funeral. Not angry exactly, but with the specific patience of someone who did not have time for this. "I'm sorry?" "The hood's already up," Nathan said. "I was just wondering if I could take a look." "You're the delivery driver," one of the junior engineers said. Not unkindly, just as a statement of clarification. "I am," Nathan agreed. There was a short silence, and then someone, Vivian never determined exactly who, laughed. It was a short laugh. Not cruel, just the involuntary kind that escapes when something strikes a room as absurd. It was enough. A few other people smiled. Someone muttered something she couldn't hear. Vivian lowered her tablet. She looked at Nathan. He was still standing by the service entrance, not defensive, not embarrassed. He had the look of a man who had been laughed at before and had long since stopped measuring his worth against it. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. "Because I drove a lot of Sterling vehicles over the years, and this engine sounds like something I recognize, even when it's not running." That was an odd thing to say. She noted it. "What do you mean you recognize it?" "The architecture, the way the components are laid out." He gestured vaguely toward the engine compartment. "I know this kind of thinking." Harmon turned around at that. Not dismissively, with the careful attention of someone who had learned over 61 years that the universe occasionally hid useful information in unexpected places. "Do you have an engineering background?" he asked. Nathan looked at him steadily. "I used to." Vivian made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. Let him look. Marcus opened his mouth. "Marcus." She said it quietly, and he closed his mouth. She looked at Nathan. "Go ahead." Nathan set the hand truck against the wall and walked to the front of the car. He did not reach for any of the diagnostic equipment. He did not consult the laptops or the readouts or the printouts. He just looked at the engine for a long time, the way a person looks at something they are reading rather than seeing. Then he reached in, carefully, asking no one's permission, but slowly enough that it was clear he was not going to touch anything without intention, and began to trace the wiring harness with one finger, following it from the rear of the engine compartment toward the fuel injection rail with the patience of a man who was not in a hurry. The room watched him. He found it 4 minutes later. It was tucked behind the secondary fuel pressure sensor bracket, in a location that made sense only if you knew exactly why that bracket was positioned where it was, which is to say, it made sense only to someone who had designed the system around that bracket, or someone who had spent a very long time studying it. It was a sensor, roughly the right size, roughly the right color, connected to the right terminals. But it was not the right sensor. The connector had been modified. The component itself, on close inspection, bore no Sterling part number. It bore a number from a different manufacturer entirely, one that produced components that were visually similar but functionally incompatible with the Apex Falcon's engine management system, which had been designed around a proprietary signal architecture that this sensor could not speak. Nathan held it up. "This isn't a Sterling component," he said. The silence in the room was different now. Harmon crossed to him in 3 steps and took the sensor from his hand, turning it over, looking at the part number. His expression changed incrementally, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a man who is revising something very quickly and quietly inside his own head. He reached for one of the diagnostic laptops. "Where was it?" Marcus asked. He'd come to stand beside Nathan, looking into the engine compartment. "Behind the secondary pressure bracket." Nathan pointed to the location. It was installed to look like it belonged there. The bracket positions it at an angle where you wouldn't see the connector modification unless you were looking from this direction. He indicated with his hand. From the top, with the diagnostic tools positioned the way they are, you'd read the sensor as present and functioning. The diagnostic would show clean, but the signal it's sending is wrong for this system, so the engine management unit doesn't know how to initialize. "Why would it be there?" Marcus said. He meant it as a practical question. He wasn't ready yet for the larger question implied by the answer. Nathan looked at him. "Someone put it there." The room absorbed this. Vivian was already on her phone. "Priya," she said when her assistant picked up, "I need you to get me security footage for the showroom and the loading dock going back to the day the Falcon was moved in. Full coverage, every angle, tonight." She paused. "Yes, I know it's a lot. Do it anyway." She lowered the phone and looked at Nathan, who had stepped back from the engine and was wiping his hand on his uniform pants with the unceremonious habit of someone who did that all day. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the engine, and his expression was the one she hadn't been able to read before, the one between recognition and something else. Now she could read it. It was grief. Not fresh grief. The old kind. The kind that is calcified. Harmon handed the counterfeit sensor to Marcus and turned to Nathan. "You'd need to replace it with the correct component to confirm. Do you know what this system calls for?" "Yes," Nathan said. "We'll have to cross-reference. I know what it calls for." Harmon studied him. He was too experienced to ask the question yet, but Vivian could see him formulating it. She was formulating it herself. They sourced the correct sensor from the parts inventory. Nathan had given them the exact specification number, which he had recited without checking anything. And Nathan installed it himself, working efficiently and without flourish in the way of someone who knew precisely what they were doing and did not need to demonstrate it. Marcus hovered. Harmon watched. The junior engineers drifted closer, the way people drift towards something they can feel is about to matter. Nathan closed the engine compartment. "Try it now," he said. Vivian was standing to the left of the car. She nodded to Marcus, who reached into the driver's door, which had been left open for 3 days, and pressed the start button. The Apex Falcon started. It didn't roar dramatically. It didn't thunder or shake. It came alive with a low, composed surge of sound, the idle settling almost immediately into a frequency that was almost felt more than heard, deep and even and certain, the sound of something doing exactly what it was designed to do. Every readout on the diagnostic laptops shifted to green simultaneously. The engine management system initialized cleanly, ran its startup sequence, and reported no faults. 3 days, 11 engineers, hundreds of thousands of dollars in diagnostic work and consulting fees, 1 delivery driver, 4 minutes, 1 wrong part. The junior engineer nearest to Vivian made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Harmon stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the running engine with the expression of a man who had just been humbled by something and was deciding how to feel about it. Marcus had his hand on the door frame of the Apex Falcon and was looking at Nathan with an expression Vivian could not fully decipher. Relief, yes, and something underneath the relief that was not quite comfortable. Vivian looked at Nathan. He was looking at the car, not at the engine now, at the car itself, at the whole thing. The way a person looks at something they used to know. She crossed the showroom floor toward him and stopped a few feet away. "That sensor location," she said. "You knew exactly where to look." He turned to her. He had the careful stillness again. "Yes. That's not the kind of thing you know from driving Sterling vehicles." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him steadily. She had spent 12 years in an industry that had treated knowledge as currency and been very selective about who it allowed to accumulate wealth. She had learned to recognize the specific quality of competence that had been suppressed, the way it sat differently in a person than ambition or performance or the desire to be seen. Nathan had it. Whatever he had been, whatever had happened to bring him to a brown uniform and a delivery hand truck in this showroom on this morning, There was something underneath that which was very large and very old and completely unresolved. "What's your last name?" she asked. He held her gaze. There was a beat. Not a hesitation exactly, but a pause of the kind that comes when a person decides whether they're ready for what comes after a certain answer. "Hale," he said. "Nathan Hale." She nodded once. Then she pulled out her phone and walked back toward the exit, already dialing Marcus's direct line. "Find out everything you can about who designed this engine," she said when he picked up. "Not the team, not the department, the person. Find the name on the original drawings." She pushed through the double glass doors without looking back. Behind her, through the glass, she could see the Apex Falcon still running, steady, composed, alive again after 3 days of silence. And she could see Nathan Hale standing beside it, with his hands in his pockets, not celebrating, not explaining himself to any of the engineers who were now beginning to approach him with questions he would probably answer briefly and accurately and without performance. He was just standing there, looking at the engine, the way you look at something you made a long time ago that you thought you'd never see again. Priya delivered the personnel file at 7:15 the following morning, which meant she had been working on it since the previous night and had probably not slept. Vivian didn't ask. She simply took the folder, an actual physical folder, because some things Vivian preferred not to have on a screen where they could be forwarded, and sat with it at the small table in the corner of her office that she used when she didn't want to feel like she was behind a desk. The file was thin. That was the first thing she noticed. For someone whose name appeared on 14 foundational patent filings spanning the years 2004 through 2009, the physical record of Nathan Hale's employment at Sterling Automotive was remarkably sparse. A hiring record, a department assignment, advanced propulsion systems, which no longer existed under that name, a series of project allocations, most of them listed under internal code names she didn't recognize. And then, in March of 2010, a termination notice. The stated reason was performance. Vivian read that twice. Then she set the folder down and looked at the window. Performance. The man who had walked into her showroom located a deliberately concealed counterfeit sensor in 4 minutes without a single diagnostic tool, and recited the exact replacement specification from memory had been terminated from Sterling Automotive for performance reasons 15 years ago. She picked the folder back up and turned to the patent filings. There were 14 of them. The first was dated November 2004, filed under the Advanced Propulsion Systems Department. The listed inventors were Nathan Hale, primary, and 2 other engineers whose names she didn't recognize, Doreen Castillo and Paul Mehta. The patent covered what the filing described as a proprietary sequential fuel injection architecture for high-displacement performance engines, with a novel signal processing approach that allowed the engine management unit to adapt injection timing in real time based on 17 simultaneous sensor inputs rather than the industry standard 4. She turned to the next filing. February 2005. Same primary inventor. Different co-inventors. A refinement of the ignition sequencing system that interfaced with the injection architecture from the first patent. By the 5th filing, Nathan Hale's name had moved from primary inventor to secondary. By the 8th, it was gone entirely. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already in the building. "Morning." "The Advanced Propulsion Systems Department," she said. "Who ran it?" A brief pause. "That was before my time here. Let me—" She heard him moving, probably toward his computer. "Victor Langford. He was VP of Engineering Development from 2003 to 2011, left to take a board seat." Vivian looked at the patent folder. "Pull everything you can find on the work that came out of that department between 2004 and 2010. Original design documents, internal memos, project logs, everything. Don't use the digital archive. Pull the physical records from storage. That's going to take— I know how long it's going to take, Marcus." Another pause. "Is this about the delivery driver?" "Pull the records," she said, and hung up. She found Nathan Hale through the delivery company's dispatch office, which required 2 phone calls and a degree of patience she didn't entirely feel. His route that day covered 3 addresses in the Jefferson Chalmers district before looping back toward the depot. The second address on the route was a machine shop on Kercheval Avenue. She drove herself. She didn't tell Priya where she was going. The machine shop was a narrow building wedged between a tire store and a vacant lot, with a hand-painted sign above the roll-up door that said Eastern Auto Works, and a smaller sign in the window that said Closed Saturdays. The roll-up door was open. Vivian could hear the sound of a vehicle engine from inside. Not running, but being worked on, the metallic punctuation of someone doing something specific and deliberate. She stood at the entrance for a moment. The interior was the organized disorder of a place that was actually used for work, rather than designed to look like it was. Tool chests along one wall, a lift in the center, parts shelved on industrial racks that went almost to the ceiling. A calendar on the wall from 2 years ago that no one had bothered to replace. The smell of oil and metal and something chemical she couldn't identify. Nathan was at the far end of the shop, standing beside a hand truck loaded with 2 small crates, talking to an older man in a shop apron who was holding a work order and shaking his head slowly. Nathan saw her before she had fully decided to step inside. He didn't react dramatically, just a slight stillness, the same quality she'd noticed in the showroom, the sense of a man who had trained himself not to show surprise. The older man looked at her and then at Nathan. "I'll get these logged in," he said, and moved away with the work order. Vivian crossed the shop floor. Nathan waited. "I wasn't expecting a house call," he said. "I looked at the patent filings," she said. He held her gaze. His expression was very even. "Okay. 14 patents. Your name is on the first 7 as primary inventor. By the 8th filing, it's gone. I know. The engine in the Apex Falcon, the foundational architecture. It's built directly on patent number 1 and patent number 3. The sequential injection system and the adaptive ignition interface. I know that too." She stopped a few feet from him. She'd rehearsed this conversation in the car and had already abandoned the rehearsal. "Why didn't you say anything yesterday? In the showroom?" Nathan looked at her steadily. "What would I have said? That you designed the engine, that you knew where the sensor was because you designed the bracket it hides behind. You would have believed me." She didn't answer immediately because the honest answer was complicated. A delivery driver claiming to have designed the centerpiece of America's most anticipated automotive reveal, in a showroom full of credentialed engineers and a consultant with 2 PhDs. "Eventually," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite bitterness. Something between them. "That's an honest answer." "What happened?" she asked. "In 2010, he was quiet for a moment. He picked up one of the crates from the hand truck, carried it to the nearest shelf, and set it down with the careful efficiency of someone who did this all day and had learned to conserve their movements. Then he turned back. "You know Victor Langford," he said, "by reputation." "He was good at certain things," Nathan said, "managing up, positioning himself, understanding which work was going to matter and making sure he was standing next to it when it did. He was a VP, I was an engineer on a team. I was 29 years old and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought the work was what mattered. I thought if the work was good, the credit would follow the work. It didn't. It followed Victor." He said it without particular heat. The kind of thing you say about weather. The first 2 patents were filed correctly. My name, Doreen's name, Paul's. Victor fought to have his name added as a contributor on the 3rd filing and won because he was a VP and we were not. By the 5th filing, I was listed as a technical advisor. By the 8th, I'd been moved to a different project and the filing stopped including me at all. What was the different project? A fuel cell initiative that went nowhere. I spent 18 months on it before they canceled it. Then they told me my performance metrics didn't justify my compensation level and offered me a separation package. He shrugged one shoulder. I was 31. I had a daughter who was 4. I took the package. Vivian absorbed this. "Did you contest the patents?" "I consulted a lawyer." He picked up the second crate. "She told me that without documentation showing my contributions, original design drawings in my name, dated correspondence, something the company hadn't controlled, it would be a long, expensive fight against a corporation with a legal department considerably larger than my savings account." He set the second crate on the shelf. "I didn't have the drawings. When they moved me off the project, they took everything." "Everything?" I had copies of some early sketches, napkin stuff, early concept work, nothing that would hold up. Vivian was quiet. She looked at the shelf where he'd stacked the crates, and she thought about the patent filings, and she thought about the Apex Falcon running in her showroom right now, its engine singing on an architecture this man had built when he was 29 years old in a department that no longer existed. The sensor, she said. The counterfeit one. Someone installed it deliberately. Yes. That means someone with access to the vehicle before the reveal. Someone who knew enough about the engine to find that specific location. A location you'd have to understand the design logic to identify. Nathan looked at her. He didn't say anything. Who else knew that engine as well as you did? She asked. Nobody, he said. Not arrogantly, just accurately. Doreen and Paul understood the systems they worked on. Victor understood enough to describe the work to board members and journalists, but the bracket placement, the sensor configuration, that was mine. I designed it specifically because it needed to be serviceable without removing the fuel rail. You had to know why it was positioned that way to know what was behind it. So whoever installed that counterfeit sensor had access to my original documentation, Nathan said, the stuff they took when they moved me off the project. The implication settled between them. Vivian thought about the security footage Prio was pulling. She thought about a sabotage designed to be invisible to 11 engineers and a consultant with 2 PhDs. She thought about the timing. 4 days before the most important product launch in Sterling's recent history, a launch that had been heavily covered in the automotive press, a launch that if it failed publicly would likely be the last thing she ever launched as CEO. I need to ask you something, she said. All right. Is there any chance this is coincidence? Wrong part installed by a technician who didn't know better? Nathan looked at her with the patience of someone who had already considered this question and discarded it. That sensor doesn't exist in any Sterling parts catalog. Someone had to source it specifically, and they had to know exactly where to put it to make every diagnostic read clean. He paused. That's not a mistake, that's a decision. She nodded once. She pulled a business card from her jacket pocket and held it out. He took it with the unhurried quality that was, she was beginning to understand, just how he moved through the world. I'd like you to come to the Sterling building tomorrow morning, she said. Not as a delivery driver. I need you to walk me through the engine documentation. Help me understand what I'm looking at in those original design files. He looked at the card. He looked at her. Why? Because someone sabotaged my company's most important vehicle using knowledge that came from your work. And because the only person in my building who could identify a counterfeit part in 4 minutes without a diagnostic computer is currently on a delivery route in Jefferson Chalmers. She said it plainly. I'd like to know what else I'm missing. He was quiet for a moment. The machine shop made its small sounds around them. The hum of something electrical, the distant clang of the tire store next door. 8 o'clock? He said. 8 o'clock. She turned to leave, then stopped. The Apex Falcon's engine, she said, without turning around. When you designed it, what did you call it? A beat of silence. The Hale series, he said, internally, on the early drawings. She nodded. She walked out of the machine shop into the flat gray Detroit morning and sat in her car for a moment before starting it, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about a 29-year-old engineer who had built something that was now worth $4 million and couldn't buy a cup of coffee with the credit. Marcus had the physical records waiting for her when she returned. They filled 2 large archival boxes, which he'd had pulled from the off-site storage facility and delivered to the small conference room adjacent to her office, the one she used for conversations she didn't want observed through the glass walls of the main conference suite. He was waiting for her beside them with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, which was Marcus's version of body language. How much of this have you looked at? She asked. Enough. He set his hand on the top of the nearest box. There are original engineering drawings in here that don't match what's in the digital archive. She stopped. Say that again. The digital archive has the design documentation for the Apex Falcon's engine going back to 2006. The originals in this box go back to 2004. And they're different. Not dramatically. The core architecture is the same, but the notation is different. The handwriting is different. The nomenclature is different. Different how? The digital versions refer to the injection system as the Langford Sequential Protocol. The originals, He opened the nearest box and lifted out a large rolled sheet of drafting paper, handling it carefully, the way you handle something old. He unrolled it on the table. It was an engineering drawing, faded at the creases, with dense technical notation in small, precise handwriting. In the title block at the lower right corner, in neat block letters, Hale Series, Sequential Injection Architecture, Revision. 3. Vivian looked at it for a long time. Someone altered the digital records, she said. Looks that way. When? I'd need IT forensics to pin the dates, but the physical originals predate the digital versions. Whoever made the changes either didn't know the physical copies existed or assumed they'd never be pulled. She thought about 14 patent filings. A 31-year-old engineer with a 4-year-old daughter accepting a separation package because the fight wasn't winnable. 18 months on a fuel cell project that went nowhere, while someone else filed his work under a different name. Get me IT forensics, she said, quietly. Not through the normal channels, Watts. Bring someone in from outside. She looked at Marcus. And I need everything you can find on Victor Langford's current activities. Board seats, consulting relationships, anything that connects him to Sterling's current operations or current competitors. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, methodical, not given to drama, but she could see him recalibrating something. Vivian, he said, if this goes where I think it's going, I know. There are board members who have relationships with Langford, people who have been here a long time. I know that too. This isn't going to be a clean process. She looked at him. It rarely is. She put her hand on the rolled drawing on the drafting paper that was 21 years old and had been sitting in a storage box while the work it documented was attributed to someone else and built into the most expensive vehicle her company had ever produced. Nathan Hale is coming in tomorrow morning at 8. I want you there. Marcus looked at the drawing. He looked at the title block. He looked at the name in the corner. Something moved across his face that might have been guilt, if guilt could be second-hand. The expression of a man who had inherited a situation he hadn't created but had benefited from without knowing it. All right, he said. She rolled the drawing back up carefully and set it in the box. Go home, she said. Get a few hours of sleep. You look terrible. You don't look great either, he said, which was the most candid thing he had said to her in 3 years and meant that he was genuinely tired. I know, she said. Go. He went. She stayed. She sat at the table in the small conference room with the 2 archive boxes and worked through them methodically for 4 hours, pulling drawings and memos and project logs in the careful way of someone building an understanding rather than looking for a specific thing. The picture that assembled itself was not a simple one. It was the kind of picture that takes years to construct and can be dismantled in a moment by one wrong move, which meant she needed to be very precise about what she did next and very careful about who she trusted. At 11:30, she found a handwritten memo at the bottom of the second box dated January 2010, 2 months before Nathan Hale's termination. It was on Victor Langford's letterhead. It was addressed to HR. It detailed a performance improvement plan for Nathan Hale that cited missed deadlines, difficulty working within team structures, and what it described as an unwillingness to collaborate on cross-departmental initiatives. Vivian read the memo twice. Then she set it aside with the drawing. She thought about a man who had spent 15 years delivering things to other people and never once, as far as she could tell, told anyone what he used to know. Not for sympathy, not for leverage. Just because the door had closed and he had understood, at 31, that certain doors don't reopen. She gathered the documents she needed, locked the archive boxes in the conference room cabinet, and turned off the lights. The Sterling building was quiet at this hour. Only the cleaning crew on the upper floors and the security desk downstairs, and somewhere on the ground floor the Apex Falcon, running its idle in the empty showroom, steady and low and patient. She stood in the dark conference room for a moment, listening to a building she had spent 12 years trying to hold together, and understood that she was about to find out how much of it had been built on ground she'd never examined. Nathan arrived at 8 o'clock exactly, which Vivian had expected. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he'd worn in the machine shop. Dark work pants, a plain gray shirt, a jacket that had been washed enough times to lose whatever shape it had originally held. He carried nothing. No bag, no folder, no prepared documents. He walked through the front entrance of the Sterling building the way a person walks through a place they used to know well and have not visited in a long time, taking in details without appearing to, cataloging small changes, keeping his face neutral. The receptionist asked for his name, and he gave it, and she found it on the approved visitor list and printed him a badge, and he clipped it to his jacket without looking at it. Priya met him at the elevator. Vivian was already in the small conference room when he arrived. Marcus was there too, standing near the window with a coffee he hadn't touched. The two archive boxes were open on the table, and the rolled engineering drawings were laid out flat, held at the corners by 4 coffee mugs. The room smelled like old paper and dry air. Nathan stopped in the doorway and looked at the drawings. Vivian watched his face. It was the same thing she'd seen in the showroom. The stillness, the quality of reading rather than seeing. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been visible before, or that she hadn't been in the right position to see. Something that a person carries when they walk back into a room they were forced to leave. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked down at the nearest drawing, the one from the bottom of the second box, the large drafting sheet with Hale Series in the title block. He didn't reach for it. He just looked at it. "Where did you find these?" he said. "Off-site storage, physical archive." "They exist." He said it quietly, not quite to her. "They exist," she confirmed. He pulled out the chair nearest to the drawing and sat down, which was the first time she had seen him sit since she'd known him. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at the drawing with an attention that excluded the room. Marcus glanced at Vivian. She gave him a small head shake. They waited. After a moment, Nathan said, without looking up, "This is revision 3 of the injection architecture. I did revisions 1 through 6 between November 2004 and March 2005. Revision 6 is what the Apex Falcon is running." He traced a line on the drawing with his finger, not touching the paper. "This sequence here, the adaptive timing cascade, that's the part that was genuinely new. Everything before it in the industry was fixed interval. This responds to load in real time, 17 inputs processed simultaneously." "We know," Marcus said. He said it carefully. "It's in the patent filings." Nathan looked up at him. "It's in the patent filings under Victor Langford's name." Marcus held his gaze. He was not a man who flinched easily, but he had the look of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable since the previous evening. "Yes," he said. "It is." "You knew that before yesterday," Nathan said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact being placed on the table. "I knew the Langford sequential protocol was the foundation of the Apex Falcon's engine," Marcus said. "I didn't know it was called something else on the original drawings. I didn't know the drawings existed." He paused. "I'm not asking you to believe that, I'm just telling you." Nathan looked at him for another moment. Then he looked back at the drawing. "All right." Vivian sat down across from him. "I need you to walk me through what you know. Not just the engine, everything. Whatever happened to the patent filings, whatever happened when they moved you off the project. I need the full picture." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in the chair and put his hands flat on the table and began. He told it the way people tell things they have carried for a long time without telling, not dramatically, without self-pity, but with the specific weight of someone who has organized the facts into a sequence over many years and knows exactly which detail goes where. The team had been small: himself, Doreen Castillo, Paul Mehta, and 2 junior engineers whose names he still remembered. Victor Langford had been their department VP, which in practical terms meant he attended the quarterly presentations and signed off on the budget allocations and was the person whose name appeared on communications with the executive team. He had not designed anything. He had understood some of it, enough to speak credibly about the work, but the engineering itself had been the team's. The first sign had come in early 2006, when the patent attorney assigned to the third filing had called Nathan to clarify a contributor attribution question, and Nathan had learned on that phone call that Langford had submitted a supplementary affidavit claiming primary inventorship of the adaptive timing cascade. Nathan had objected. The attorney had explained that the affidavit was on file and that disputing it would require Nathan to produce original dated documentation demonstrating prior independent development of the concept. Nathan had gone to his files and discovered that the earliest drawings, the napkin stage concept sketches from 2004, which would have established the timeline clearly, were missing from his project folder. The folder itself was intact. The early pages were gone. "You think Langford took them," Vivian said. "I know he took them," Nathan said. "I can't prove it, but I know." "Why didn't you escalate it internally?" Nathan looked at her. "I was 27 years old and Victor Langford had been at this company for 16 years. He had relationships with 4 board members. He had personally recruited the VP of legal from her previous firm. He said it without bitterness, just with the flatness of someone describing a landscape. I filed a formal objection through HR. 6 weeks later, I was on a performance improvement plan. Marcus set his coffee down. "The memo," he said, "January 2010. "You found it," Nathan said. "It's in the box." Nathan nodded once. "The PIP was written in a way that made it impossible to satisfy. The metrics were vague enough that any outcome could be characterized as insufficient. I understood what it was. My lawyer understood what it was. She also told me that wrongful termination cases against corporations are expensive to litigate and difficult to win when the company controls the documentation." He spread his hands on the table. "So I took the separation package." "How much?" Marcus asked. $40,000 and a non-disparagement agreement. The room was quiet. $40,000. For an engine architecture that was now the centerpiece of a $4 million vehicle and had generated, Vivian knew from the financial report she had memorized, approximately $340 million in licensing revenue over the previous decade through Sterling's partnership agreements with 3 other manufacturers who had licensed the core injection technology. She did not say this out loud. She didn't need to. "The non-disparagement agreement," she said. "Does it cover patent claims?" "My lawyer at the time said it was broad enough to create risk for me if I pursued anything publicly. She recommended against it." He paused. "A different lawyer, later, told me the agreement was probably unenforceable as written in that context. By then it was 2015, and the statute of limitations on the patent claims had run out." Vivian looked at the drawing. She looked at the name in the title block. She thought about the external forensics team she had brought in the previous afternoon, a firm called Meridian Digital that Marcus had used for a previous investigation, who were currently working through the digital archive looking for evidence of record alteration. "I got a preliminary report this morning," she said, "from the IT forensics team." Nathan looked at her. "The digital design files for the Apex Falcon's engine were modified in 2007. The modifications replaced the original project nomenclature with the Langford Protocol naming convention. The metadata on the files was altered to make the modifications appear to be original creation dates." She watched his face. "The forensics team says it was done carefully, professionally, not a quick job." Nathan was still. "What I need to understand," she said carefully, "is whether this is just about the patents, or whether there's more." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you mean?" "The counterfeit sensor wasn't installed 15 years ago. It was installed recently. The security footage we pulled places it in the 48 hours after the Apex Falcon arrived in the showroom, before we'd positioned any cameras inside the vehicle." She kept her voice even. "Whoever installed it had access to the showroom during that window, knew the engine well enough to find the correct location, and had sourced a specific incompatible component in advance. That's not opportunistic sabotage. That's planned." "Yes," Nathan said. "Which means whoever did it had a reason to want the unveiling to fail. Now." She leaned forward slightly. "Not 15 years ago. Now." Nathan put his hands together on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he said, "There was something I noticed when I looked at the engine yesterday, besides the sensor." Vivian went still. "What?" "The fuel injection rail. The one running on the Apex Falcon is a third-generation version of my original design. I recognized it. But there were three components on the rail that didn't originate from Sterling's manufacturing processes. He looked at her. I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure, and because I'd already found what was stopping the engine. But I went home last night and looked up the part numbers I'd memorized. What did you find? Two of the three components are manufactured by a company called Veritech Parts Solutions. They supply warranty replacement parts to 7 automotive manufacturers, including Sterling. He paused. The third component has a part number that traces back to a shell company in Delaware. I found the registration through a business filing database. The shell company was incorporated in 2019. Marcus had pulled out his phone and was writing something down. Who owns the shell company? Vivian asked. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington. I couldn't get past that. Nathan looked at her. But Veritech Parts Solutions, Sterling has a warranty supply contract with them. That contract would have been negotiated at the VP level. Vivian looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his phone. She could see him running the same calculation she was running. Warranty supply contracts, VP-level relationships, a shell company sourcing components through a legitimate supplier. A corruption network that had made itself invisible by embedding inside the normal flow of the company's operations. How long has the Veritech contract been active? She asked Marcus. I'd have to check. But Veritech came up in the Regent brake scandal. He said it slowly, like a man testing the weight of something. They were a supplier in that chain. I remember seeing the name in the settlement documentation. The Regent brake scandal. $340 million in settlements. The quality control failure that had nearly destroyed Sterling's credibility in the luxury segment and had been, as far as anyone had ever determined, a systemic manufacturing defect. No individual had been identified as responsible. No vendor had faced legal consequences. The settlement had been with the affected consumers, and the internal investigation had concluded that the failures were the result of insufficient quality controls rather than deliberate action. Vivian had inherited that conclusion when she became CEO. She had never been fully satisfied with it, but the lawyers had advised her that reopening the investigation created more legal exposure than it resolved, and she had filed it in the category of things she would return to when the company was on steadier ground. "Get me the Regent file," she said. Her voice was very flat. Everything. The original investigation materials, not the summary. Marcus nodded. She turned back to Nathan. The components on the fuel rail. You said there were 3 that didn't originate from Sterling's processes. Are they functional? The 2 Veritech ones are functional but below Sterling's stated quality specifications. They'll work. They'll just fail earlier than a genuine Sterling component. Not catastrophically. Gradually. In a way that looks like normal wear. He met her eyes. Which means warranty claims. Fraudulent warranty claims. Parts installed below specification that generate premature failures, that generate warranty service that gets billed at the rate of genuine components. A scheme that required access to the parts supply chain, relationships at the VP level, and the patience to build something that looked like a normal flow of business until you knew what you were looking at. And the Apex Falcon, Sterling's most visible, most scrutinized product, would have been the crown jewel of the scheme. Every component on that vehicle would be examined, discussed, written about. If substandard parts appeared in the Apex Falcon's warranty claims 3 years from now, the damage to the company would be beyond what Vivian could calculate. Unless the car had never launched at all. Unless the unveiling had failed, publicly and spectacularly, and the Apex Falcon had been shelved. She sat with this for a moment. Someone wanted the launch to fail, she said. Not just delayed. Failed, publicly, in a way that couldn't be recovered from. Nathan said nothing. He had already arrived at this. Because if the Apex Falcon launches and succeeds, it changes the level of scrutiny on every Sterling component. Quality audits, supply chain reviews, independent testing, things that would eventually surface the counterfeit parts in the supply chain. She was thinking out loud now, and she knew it, but Marcus was keeping up and Nathan was keeping up, and there was a kind of efficiency in saying it plainly. The sabotage wasn't about the car. The car was a threat to the scheme. That's how I read it, Nathan said. Marcus sat down. He looked like a man who had come into a meeting expecting one conversation and found himself in a considerably larger one. How long has this been running? He said. The supply chain scheme. The Regent failures were documented from 2018 onward, Vivian said. If Veritech was in the supply chain then, at least 7 years, Nathan said. 7 years of fraudulent warranty claims embedded inside a legitimate supply relationship, generating costs that the company had absorbed as the normal expense of a quality control problem it had blamed on its own manufacturing processes. Vivian thought about the settlement. She thought about the $340 million. She thought about how much of that money had represented genuine damages and how much of it had been the downstream consequence of parts that had been designed to fail. She stood up. Not because she had somewhere to go, she needed to move, to do something with the energy of what she was understanding. She went to the window and stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked out at East Jefferson Avenue, at the morning traffic moving in the flat gray light. Nathan, she said. Yes. The documentation you have. The early concept sketches, whatever physical material you kept from 2004 and 2005. I need to see all of it. A silence. Why? He said. She turned from the window. Because the forensics team is building a record of the digital alterations. The physical drawings from the archive establish the original attribution. But the earliest pre-patent concepts, the material from before the formal project began, that's the piece that closes the timeline. She held his gaze. I'm not building a case against you. I'm building a case against what was done, and I need every piece of documentation that exists. Nathan looked at the table. He looked at the rolled drawing with his name in the corner. He had the expression of a man calculating something. Not numbers, but the older arithmetic of risk and trust, and the specific cost of opening a door you had deliberately kept closed for 15 years. It's at my apartment, he said finally. I have a folder. Can you bring it in? I can bring it in today. She nodded. Marcus will be here. I have 2 meetings I can't move, but I'll be back by noon. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. One more thing. Nathan looked at her. The third component on the fuel rail, the one from the Delaware Shell Company, the one you couldn't trace past the registered agent. She stopped at the door. I have a corporate attorney who specializes in this kind of entity structure. With a court order, we can get past the registered agent. The question is whether the name on the other side of that shell company is the name I think it is. Nathan didn't ask what name she was thinking of. He already knew. They both did. It might not be, she said. Corporate structures like that are built for deniability. Whoever set it up may be 2 or 3 layers removed. Or it might be, he said. Or it might be, she agreed. She left the conference room. In the hallway, she stopped and stood for a moment with her hand flat against the wall, not moving, just breathing. The building was fully awake now. She could hear phones, footsteps, the elevator chiming somewhere down the hall. A company that had been running on a foundation she had not examined closely enough, because the people who built the foundation had worked very hard to make sure no one would. She pushed off the wall and walked toward her office. She had 2 meetings to get through and a phone call to make to her corporate attorney and a board chair she was going to have to call by end of day. And she needed to decide, very carefully, exactly how much she was going to tell him and in what order, because at least 2 members of the Sterling board had relationships with Victor Langford that predated her tenure at the company. The Apex Falcon was running 2 floors below her, steady and low, the idle of an engine that had been waiting 15 years for someone to call it by its right name. Nathan came back at 11:15 with a manila folder that was thicker than Vivian had expected and thinner than the situation deserved. He set it on the conference room table without ceremony. It was the kind of folder that had been moved many times, the edges worn soft, a water stain on the bottom right corner, the clasp bent from being opened and closed over many years. Vivian looked at it and thought about all the places it must have traveled. Apartments, probably several of them. Maybe a storage unit at some point, the kind of thing you carry because you can't bring yourself to throw it away, even when keeping it costs you something every time you see it. Marcus was already in the room. He had the Regent file spread across the left side of the table and his reading glasses on, which he only wore when he was genuinely concentrating. Nathan opened the folder. The contents were not dramatic in appearance. A collection of loose sheets, some proper drafting paper, some plain white printer paper, some actual napkin stage sketches on the kind of paper you find in a diner. All of it dated in pencil in the margins, a habit Nathan explained without being asked. He had dated everything from the beginning because an engineering professor in his second year of college had told him that the person who dates their work is the person who owns their work, and he had never forgotten it. The earliest sheet was from September 2004. A rough diagram of an injection sequencing concept with handwritten calculations in the margins and a note at the bottom that said 17 inputs. Can this be made stable at high RPM? The date was written in the upper right corner, September 14th, 2004. 7 weeks before the first formal patent filing. Vivian looked at it. She looked at the date. She thought about what a forensics attorney could do with a dated original concept sketch that predated the patent filing by 7 weeks, in the context of a digital archive that had been demonstrably altered in 2007. "May I?" she said, gesturing toward the folder. "Yes," Nathan said. She went through it carefully, piece by piece, setting each sheet down in sequence. Marcus came around the table and looked over her shoulder without touching anything. Nathan sat across from them and watched, and his face was the careful, neutral face he wore in public, but his hands on the table were not entirely still. There were 31 pages in total. The progression was visible, rough concept to refined sketch to formal drawing, with the dates marching forward from September 2004 to February 2005. The adaptive timing cascade appeared first as a question mark on a diagram in October 2004, evolved through 3 increasingly detailed sketches, and arrived at something close to its final form in a drawing dated January 12, 2005. 6 days before Victor Langford had filed the supplementary affidavit claiming primary inventorship of the concept. Marcus took his glasses off. He set them on the table. 6 days, he said. Yes, Nathan said. He filed the affidavit 6 days after this drawing. He would have seen the drawing. I presented the refined cascade concept in a department review in the second week of January. He was in the room. Vivian set the last page down. She aligned the edges of the stack carefully, a habit she had when she needed a moment to think. These establish the timeline, she said. Combined with the forensics report on the digital alterations, this closes the attribution question. She looked at Nathan. An attorney is going to tell me these are not sufficient for a patent claim because the statute has run, but for the purposes of what I'm building right now, for the board, this is what I need. Nathan nodded. He wasn't looking at the documents anymore. He was looking at the table. Vivian's phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from her corporate attorney, Daniel Frey, who had been working since 6 that morning on the Delaware Shell Company. She read the text twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table. The Shell Company, she said, behind the registered agent. Both men looked at her. It's a holding entity called Northgate Industrial Consulting, incorporated in Delaware in 2019, as Nathan said. The beneficial owner, she paused, not for effect, because she was organizing the implications before she said them out loud. The beneficial owner is listed as a trust. The trust is administered by a law firm in Chicago. Daniel got a contact at the firm to confirm, off the record, that the trust was established by an individual who also holds board observer status at Veritech Parts Solutions. She picked up her phone and turned it toward them so they could read the name on the screen. Marcus looked at it. His jaw tightened. Nathan looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Not surprise, which he had clearly left behind years ago where Victor Langford was concerned, but a kind of crystallization. The face of a man who has suspected something for 15 years and is now watching it become a fact. Board observer status, Marcus said, not a director. Observer status at Veritech gives him access to supply chain negotiations and contract structures without the legal exposure of a directorship, Vivian said. He can influence which companies Veritech does business with, which contracts get prioritized, which quality standards get applied. without his name appearing on any Veritech-facing documents that Sterling would ever review. How long has he held the observer position? Daniel is still pulling that, but the Shell Company Incorporation date is 2019. The Regent quality failures began documented escalation in 2018. The timeline fits. She set the phone down. He left Sterling in 2011 with a board seat and a consulting arrangement that ended in 2014. For 5 years, he was quiet enough that nobody was watching him. Then he built something. Using what he knew about Sterling's supply chain, Marcus said, and relationships he'd cultivated while he was here. She looked at the table while the folder, the drawings, the Regent file spread open on the left side. The assembled evidence of 2 separate wrongs separated by 15 years, connected by one man's appetite for building things on other people's foundations. The Apex Falcon was the problem. When the Falcon project was approved and the engine architecture was selected, Langford would have understood what a successful launch meant. Independent testing, supply chain audits, quality certifications from 3 different regulatory bodies. Everything that a vehicle at this price point and this level of public scrutiny attracts. She paused. The Veritech scheme could survive Sterling's normal operations. It could not survive what comes after a successful Apex Falcon launch. So he needed the launch to fail, Marcus said. He needed it to fail badly enough that the program got canceled. Not delayed, canceled. Because a delay with a successful eventual launch still triggers the same scrutiny. She looked at Nathan. And he had access to the engine documentation. The original documentation, the material he took in 2005. He knew that engine better than anyone at Sterling currently working here, because nobody currently working here was in the room when it was designed. Nathan was quiet for a moment. The person who installed the sensor, he said. That wasn't Victor Langford. He's 63 years old and he hasn't had active access to this building in over a decade. No, Vivian agreed. Someone installed it for him. Someone who had current access. She looked at Marcus. The security footage. Marcus nodded slowly. He pulled his phone out and made a call. Vivian could hear it ring twice before someone picked up. The security team that had been reviewing the footage since 2 days prior. Marcus asked a question, listened, asked another question, listened longer. His expression did not change, but his posture did, in the small way of someone receiving information they had been half expecting. Thank you, he said, and ended the call. He looked at Vivian. The footage from the 48-hour window around the Falcon's arrival. There's a gap. How long? 11 minutes. On the showroom camera closest to the vehicle. The gap was created by looping a prior segment of footage. 11 minutes of empty showroom replayed in sequence. It's a professional job. Our security team didn't catch it in the initial review. Who has access to the security system? The security department, facilities management, and executive-level keycard holders. He paused. There are 9 current executive-level keycard holders. 9 people. Vivian thought about the board members with Langford relationships. She thought about the people who had been at Sterling long enough to know the building's security infrastructure well enough to loop footage without triggering an alarm. She thought about the VP of Facilities, Raymond Holst, who had been at Sterling for 22 years, and whose name she had seen twice in the Regent investigation documents that Marcus had pulled, not prominently, not in a way that had flagged at the time, but there. She did not say Raymond Holst's name out loud. Not yet. Not in a room where she was still assembling what she knew versus what she could prove. I need 2 things, she said. First, the Meridian Digital Forensics report needs to be finalized today. Whatever they have, I need it in written form by 5 o'clock. She looked at Marcus. Second, I need you to arrange a board meeting, not a regular session, an emergency session, day after tomorrow. Marcus sat up slightly. That's the day of the unveiling. I know. Vivian, the unveiling happens, she said. The Apex Falcon launches on Saturday as planned. But before it does, the board needs to understand what has been operating inside this company. She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has made a decision and is now past the point of revisiting it. If I go to the board after the launch, the story becomes about the launch. I need them to understand what the launch means before it happens, what it's being protected from. Marcus was quiet. He was running through the implications the way she had already run through them. Who on the board would be with her? Who would stall? Who had reasons she didn't yet know to be interested in the outcome? Henderson will push back, he said. Gerald Henderson, the board chair, who had been at Sterling since before Vivian's tenure, and who had a professional history with Langford that predated the company. He's going to want an independent review before any action. He can have an independent review, after the emergency session. She looked at Marcus steadily. I'm not asking the board to take action on day one. I'm asking them to receive information. What they do with it is their function, but they receive it before the launch, not after. Marcus nodded. One nod, final. I'll make the calls. She turned to Nathan. He had been listening to all of this with the quality he brought to everything, attentively, without performing attention. He had not interjected. He had answered what was asked and offered what was relevant and otherwise stayed out of the way of her thinking, which she appreciated more than she had told him. The board meeting, she said. I want you there. He looked at her carefully. Why? Because I'm going to present the engineering documentation and the forensics findings. I'm going to walk them through the supply chain scheme and the digital record alterations and the Veritech connection. But the engine, she stopped. The engine I can present from documents. What I can't present from documents is what it was like to build it, what the decisions were, why the cascade works the way it works, what problem you were solving when you designed the bracket placement. She looked at him directly. I need the board to understand that this isn't a paperwork dispute. It's not a technical anomaly. A person built something, and someone else erased that person, and the thing that was built is now worth $4 million and running in my showroom. Nathan was quiet for long enough that she wasn't sure he was going to answer. I'm not asking you to perform anything, she said. I'm asking you to be in the room and answer questions honestly if they're asked. He looked at the folder on the table, the 31 pages of dated sketches and drawings, the September 2004 napkin with the question mark where the timing cascade would eventually be. All right, he said. She stood. Go home. Get some rest. Be here Friday morning at 9. She paused. And Nathan? Bring the folder. He picked it up from the table and held it against his side, the way he'd probably carried it for 15 years. He stood and walked toward the door, then stopped. Doreen Castillo, he said, and Paul Mehta. They were on the original team. I don't know where Paul is. We lost touch after I left. But Doreen is still in Detroit. She works at a supplier in Dearborn. He looked at Vivian over his shoulder. She has her own documentation. I know because we talked about it once, years ago. She kept copies of her work, too. Vivian looked at Marcus. Marcus was already writing the name down. I'll find her, he said. Nathan left. His footsteps went down the hall and faded. The room was quiet. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, indifferent to the particular human complications being resolved in one conference room on one Thursday morning, in one building on East Jefferson Avenue. Vivian stood at the window and looked at the street. Do you think Henderson is involved? Marcus asked. He said it carefully, the way you ask a question you're not sure you want answered. I think Henderson has had a 20-year relationship with Victor Langford and has never had a reason to look closely at what Langford was doing with Sterling's supply chain relationships. She turned from the window. I think there's a difference between complicity and willful blindness, and I think Gerald Henderson has spent a long time making himself comfortable in that space. That's not exactly an exoneration. No, she agreed. It isn't. She gathered the documents she needed from the table, the forensics preliminary report, the key pages from the Regent file, Nathan's folder. She left the archive boxes for Marcus to manage. One more thing, she said at the door. Raymond Holst, Facilities VP. His name appears twice in the Regent investigation materials. I want everything on him. His current access levels, his external relationships, any financial irregularities in his department budget going back to 2018. She said it evenly. Quietly. Marcus looked at her. You think he's the inside contact? I think someone looped 11 minutes of security footage and installed a counterfeit sensor in a vehicle that was under a locked showroom during that window. She said it simply. That's someone with a key, knowledge of the security system, and a reason. Raymond Holst has been at this company long enough to have all three. She paused. Don't confront him. Don't tip anything. Just pull what you can and have it on my desk by tomorrow morning. She walked out. The rest of the day moved in the particular way of days when a great deal is happening invisibly. Vivian took her 2 meetings, one with the PR team about Saturday's launch communications, which she sat through with the careful blankness of someone maintaining a surface while a considerable amount moved underneath it, and one with the head of legal, Karen Osei, who Vivian had trusted since the Regent settlement, and who she now brought fully into the picture in a 90-minute conversation that left Karen sitting very still in her chair with the expression of an attorney who is reorganizing her understanding of a very large problem. "You'll need to notify the SEC at some point," Karen said. "If the Veritex scheme constitutes securities fraud, and it might, depending on how the warranty claim revenues were reported, there's a disclosure obligation." "How soon?" "That depends on what the forensics report confirms. But we're not in a wait-and-see situation if the board meeting confirms the scheme's scope." Karen looked at her papers. "The counterparty risk on this is significant, Vivian. When this becomes public, it becomes public after the launch," Vivian said. "Not before." Karen looked at her. "You're launching the car knowing there are substandard components on the fuel rail." "I'm launching the car after replacing those components with genuine sterling parts, which Marcus is authorizing today from our primary supplier." She met Karen's eyes. "The car that goes on the showroom floor Saturday is clean. The scheme is documented. The board knows before it happens, and the launch happens because canceling it is what someone spent considerable effort and planning trying to make happen, and I'm not going to hand them that." Karen was quiet for a moment. "You've thought this through." "I've had 2 days." "That's not very long." "No," Vivian agreed. "It isn't." Karen left at 5:30. Marcus sent the Raymond Holst preliminary at 6, 2 pages, which was enough. Holst's department budget showed a pattern of irregular small-dollar expenditures across 4 vendor categories over the previous 3 years, amounts calibrated to stay below the internal audit threshold. His external relationships included a consulting arrangement with a facilities management firm that, one layer in, shared a corporate address with a subsidiary of Veritech Parts Solutions. Vivian read it standing at her desk with her jacket still on. Then she forwarded it to Karen with a 1-line note and forwarded a separate copy to the Meridian Digital team with instructions to cross-reference against the security access logs for the showroom. She stood in her office for a moment after she sent it. The building was quiet around her. The cleaning crew would be on the upper floors. Security at the desk downstairs. And somewhere on the ground floor, the Apex Falcon was either still running its idle or had been shut down for the night. She couldn't hear it from this far up. She thought about Nathan Hale going home to wherever he lived, carrying a manila folder that had been waiting 15 years for the right room to matter in. She thought about Doreen Castillo in Dearborn, who apparently had her own folder, her own copies, her own version of the same long waiting. She thought about what it cost a person to carry something that heavy for that long and never be able to set it down because there was nowhere to put it that felt like enough. She turned off her office light. She took the elevator to the ground floor. She walked through the empty lobby and pushed through the glass doors into the showroom. The Apex Falcon had been shut down. It sat in the showroom lights, still, dark blue shading to purple at the edges, completely itself. The hood was closed. You could not see the engine from here. You could not see the bracket or the fuel injection rail or the empty space where a counterfeit sensor had sat for 48 hours, while 11 engineers ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong. Vivian stood at the edge of the showroom and looked at it for a long time. She was not a sentimental person by nature. She had not survived 12 years in this industry by being sentimental, but she understood, standing in that empty room at 6:45 on a Thursday evening, that what was at stake on Saturday was not just a product launch, or a company's market position, or her own tenure as CEO. It was the question of whether the things people built with genuine intelligence and genuine effort could survive the specific kind of human failure that was patient and calculating and wore the right suits and knew the right people and understood that most institutions would rather protect their own version of history than examine it. She had 2 days to find out. She turned off the showroom lights and went home. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning at 9, which meant that by 8:15 the Sterling Conference Suite on the 14th floor held 7 of the 9 board members, 3 attorneys including Karen Osei, Marcus Webb, with 2 bankers' boxes of documentation, and a forensics analyst from Meridian Digital named Sonia Park, who had not slept in 36 hours and looked like it and did not appear to care. Gerald Henderson arrived at 8:50. He was 71 years old, silver-haired, with the practiced composure of a man who had sat on 12 boards over 4 decades and understood that composure was itself a form of power. He shook hands with the members already seated, nodded to Karen, looked at the bankers' boxes without expression, and took his chair at the head of the table. He looked at Vivian. "This is unusual," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. You were vague on the nature of the matter in your message." "I was deliberate about that." He held her gaze for a moment. Gerald Henderson had not built a 40-year career by being easily rattled, but she could see him making a calculation, reading the room, reading the boxes, reading the presence of a forensics analyst he didn't recognize. "All right," he said, "let's proceed." Nathan was in the small anteroom adjacent to the conference suite. Vivian had put him there deliberately, not to hide him, but because she wanted the board to absorb the documentary evidence before they absorbed him. She had learned, across 12 years of difficult meetings, that sequence mattered. You didn't lead with the person. You led with the facts, and you let the facts do the work that facts were designed to do, and then you brought in the person so the board understood what the facts represented in human terms. She spent the first 40 minutes on the supply chain scheme. Sonia Park presented the forensics findings, the digital record alterations dated to 2007, the metadata manipulation, the specific files that had been modified, and the original versions recovered from the physical archive. Karen walked through the Veritech connection, the shell company structure, the beneficial ownership tracing to Langford. Marcus presented the Regent file analysis, the correlation between the Veritech supply relationship and the documented quality failures, the warranty claim patterns, the financial exposure over 7 years that the company had absorbed as manufacturing error and was now, on closer examination, something considerably more deliberate. The room was quiet in the specific way of people who are absorbing something they cannot immediately find a way to dismiss. Raymond Holst had been placed on administrative suspension at 7 that morning, quietly, with security escort, his key cards deactivated before he arrived at the building. Karen had advised that any confrontation needed to wait for law enforcement involvement, which she had initiated the previous evening through a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Holst did not yet know the scope of what had been assembled. He knew only that his access had been revoked and that he was to speak to no one from the company without an attorney present. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, made any calls to Victor Langford. Karen had made sure his devices were imaged before he left the building. Henderson listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not his usual pattern in board meetings. He asked 3 questions during the Veritech presentation. Precise questions, the kind that tested the edges of what was being claimed rather than the center of it. Vivian answered them directly and without hedging. The second time he asked a question, she said, "Gerald, I know what you're checking for. If there were a viable alternative explanation for the shell company ownership structure, Daniel would have found it. There isn't one." He looked at her steadily and then nodded once and sat back. It was at the 90-minute mark, when Karen had finished the legal exposure summary, that Henderson said, "The engine architecture." Vivian looked at him. "You've shown me what was done to the supply chain records," he said. "You've shown me the Falcon sabotage, but the foundation of all of it, the original attribution, I want to understand that fully before we discuss next steps." He looked at the forensics slide still displayed on the screen at the end of the table. "Who actually designed the Hale series engine?" Vivian stood. "I'd like to bring someone in," she said. She went to the anteroom herself. Nathan was sitting in one of the chairs along the wall with the manila folder across his knees and the specific stillness of a man who has been waiting in rooms for most of his adult life. He looked up when she came in. "They're ready," she said. He stood. He tucked the folder under his arm. He looked at her with the careful, evaluating quality he'd had from the beginning, the look of a person who has learned that rooms are not always what they appear to be until you're inside them. "You don't need to convince them of anything," she said. "Just answer what they ask." "I know," he said. He walked into the conference suite. 7 board members and 3 attorneys looked at him. a 46-year-old man in a plain gray shirt with an old manila folder, and the unhurried bearing of someone who had made peace with not being impressive on first glance. Henderson looked at him with the assessment of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. "Mr. Hale," Vivian said, "thank you for being here." He sat in the chair at the side of the table that Marcus had left open. He set the folder on the table in front of him and put his hands flat on either side of it and looked at Henderson. "The board chair would like to understand the engine architecture," Vivian said. "In your own words." Nathan was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, organizing. "The problem I was trying to solve in 2004, he began, was response lag. In high-displacement performance engines, the gap between what the driver asks for and what the engine delivers runs through the fuel injection system. The system is reading sensor inputs and adjusting in sequence, and by the time it's processed 4 inputs and made a decision, conditions have already changed." He paused. "I wanted to process 17 inputs simultaneously and have the system adapt in real time, not in sequence. The challenge was signal stability. If you're reading 17 things at once, the noise compounds. The adaptive timing cascade was the solution to the noise problem. It's a filtering architecture that weights the inputs by relevance to current operating conditions. So the system is always making decisions based on what's actually happening in the engine rather than what was happening a fraction of a second ago." He opened the folder and laid the September 2004 napkin sketch on the table. "This is where it started. This question here." He pointed to the margin note. 17 inputs. Can this be made stable at high RPM? That's October 2004. The answer took me 4 months to work out." He laid the subsequent pages in sequence, in the order Vivian had arranged them 2 days ago, the progression from question to answer rendered in pencil and drafting ink across 31 pages. By February 2005, revision 6 of the architecture was complete. That is what the Apex Falcon is running now. Henderson leaned forward and looked at the napkin. He looked at the date in the corner. He looked at Nathan. "You've carried this documentation for 20 years. 21 years, Nathan said. "Why?" Nathan looked at him. It was a direct question, and he gave it a direct answer. "Because it was mine. And because—" He stopped, started again, differently. "I used to think I kept it because someday I'd need it. Some case, some legal argument. But the statute ran out in 2015, and I still kept it." He looked at the pages laid out on the table. "I think I kept it because throwing it away felt like agreeing with what happened, and I wasn't willing to agree with it." The room was quiet. Henderson sat back. He looked at Vivian. "What are you proposing?" "3 things," she said. "First, the board authorizes engagement of outside legal counsel to pursue civil action against Victor Langford, Raymond Holst, and any additional parties identified in the ongoing federal investigation. This is separate from whatever the FBI pursues criminally. Second, the board authorizes a full independent audit of the Veritech supply relationship going back to 2018 with the findings to be disclosed to the SEC in accordance with Karen's guidance on our disclosure obligations." She paused. "Third, the company formally acknowledges Nathan Hale as the original designer of the Hale series engine architecture. Not through litigation, because that window has closed, but through the public record. When the Apex Falcon launches tomorrow, the engineering documentation we release to the press and the technical community identifies the foundational architecture correctly." Henderson looked at Nathan. "Would that be acceptable to you, Mr. Hale?" Nathan looked at Henderson with the same even quality he brought to everything. "That's not why I'm here," he said. "I'm here because Ms. Mercer asked me to be, and because the engine was sabotaged, and I knew why, and it seemed wrong to know something relevant and say nothing." He paused. "What you do with the attribution is your decision. I'm not asking the company for anything." Henderson looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes a person's measure seriously. "That's either very principled or very tired," he said. "Probably some of both," Nathan said. Something shifted in Henderson's expression, not warmth exactly, but the grudging recalibration of a man who has reassessed something he thought he already understood. He looked around the table. "Discussion," he said. The discussion lasted 40 minutes. It was not unanimous in tone. Two board members wanted a slower process, an independent verification of the forensics before any public acknowledgement, the standard institutional caution that organizations reach for when the alternative is moving fast toward an uncomfortable truth. Vivian let them talk. She answered what was asked, deferred to Karen on the legal questions, and waited with the patience of someone who had done the preparation and trusted the preparation. The vote was 7-2 in favor of all three proposals. Henderson looked at Vivian when it was done. "The launch is tomorrow," he said. It wasn't a question, but it had a question inside it. "The launch is tomorrow," she confirmed. "The car is ready?" Marcus certified the fuel rail components were replaced yesterday afternoon. "The car is clean." She met his eyes. "It was always going to be ready. That's the point." Henderson nodded. He looked at Nathan. "Mr. Hale." He said the name with a deliberateness that made it a statement in itself. "Thank you for your time." Nathan stood. He gathered the pages from the table and replaced them in the folder with the same care he had used to lay them out. He clipped the folder shut. He shook the hand Henderson extended across the table, brief and without performance, and then he walked out of the conference suite. Vivian followed him into the hallway. He was standing near the elevator, looking at nothing in particular. She came to stand beside him. 7-2, she said. "I heard." "That's a strong vote." "Yes." He pressed the elevator button. She looked at him. He was doing the thing he did, the careful stillness, the absence of visible reaction. But she had spent enough time with him now to read underneath it, and what she saw underneath it was not what she would have expected. It wasn't relief, it wasn't vindication, it was something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a man who had waited a long time for a room to finally say the right thing, and was discovering that the right thing, said 21 years late, lands differently than you imagined it would when you were 31 and had just handed over a separation package and gone to pick up your 4-year-old daughter. "How is she?" Vivian asked. "Your daughter." He looked at her, slightly surprised. 25, he said. "She's in grad school. Environmental engineering. Does she know about any of this?" "She knows I used to work here. She knows I left." He paused. "She doesn't know what I left with." "Are you going to tell her?" He was quiet for a moment. The elevator arrived and the doors opened, and he stood there without getting in, thinking about something she couldn't see. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. There's a version of it that's useful to tell, and a version that's just—" He stopped. "She's 25, and she's good at what she does, and she doesn't need to spend time being angry on my behalf about something that happened before she started school. She needs to be 25 and good at what she does." The elevator doors closed without him in it. Vivian looked at him. "What do you need?" she asked. He turned to her with slight surprise, as if the question were unexpected. Maybe it was. She suspected that people had been asking Nathan Hale what he could do for them for long enough that the reverse had become unfamiliar. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Actually—" "And?" He looked down the hallway toward the stairs. He looked back at her. "There are kids coming out of technical programs who are good with computers and diagnostic software, but don't know what they're actually looking at. They run a scan. The scan says no fault. They stop looking." He said it with the mild exasperation of someone who has watched this pattern enough times to find it genuinely irritating. The machine can't always tell you what's wrong. Sometimes you have to look at the machine, understand what it was trying to do when it was designed and why, and then you can see what's actually failing. He paused. "I've been doing that with junior mechanics at Eastern Auto for a couple of years, informally. I was thinking about whether there was a more structured way to do it." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "Sterling has a technical apprenticeship program," she said. "It's been underfunded and undermanaged for 4 years. We bring in 20 apprentices a year and hand them to department supervisors who don't have time for them." She paused. "If someone wanted to rebuild it from the ground up, curriculum, methodology, practical training, I would fund that, properly." He looked at her with the evaluating quality. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a program. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A job has a supervisor. A program has a director." She said it plainly. "You'd report to Marcus on administrative matters. The curriculum and methodology would be yours. He was quiet. The elevator came back and the doors opened again and again. Neither of them got in. Down the hall, through the glass walls of the conference suite, she could see the board members beginning to gather their papers and stand. "I'm not an easy person to have around," he said finally. "I don't defer to credentials. I say what I think a thing is, regardless of what someone with a title thinks it is." "I'm aware of that. That's going to create friction with people here." "Probably," she agreed. "Do you want the program or not?" He looked at the elevator. He looked at the folder under his arm. He looked at her with the expression of a man making a decision that is simple in its outcome and complicated in everything it represents. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Monday morning. We'll work out the details." He pressed the elevator button for the third time. This time, when the doors opened, he stepped in. He turned around and she was already walking back toward the conference suite. "Miss Mercer," he said. She turned. He stood in the elevator with the folder against his side and the doors beginning to close. "The car," he said. "The Falcon. When you launch it tomorrow—" He paused. He seemed to be deciding whether to say the rest of it. The doors finished closing. She stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at where he'd been. Then she went back to work. The Apex Falcon launched at 2 o'clock the following afternoon. The showroom was full. Journalists, industry analysts, photographers, a handful of carefully selected customers who had been on the waiting list for 3 years. The car sat under its cover at the center of the floor with the showroom lights at full brightness. And when the cover came off, the room did the thing that rooms do when something genuinely beautiful is revealed, which is that it went quiet before it went loud. Vivian stood at the edge of the platform where she'd given her remarks and watched the crowd move toward the car. She had not mentioned Nathan Hale in her remarks. That would come in the technical documentation released simultaneously to the automotive press, which identified the foundational engine architecture correctly and attributed it to its original designer. The journalists who cared about engineering would find it. The ones who covered corporate governance would find the SEC disclosure that Karen had filed the previous afternoon. The FBI contact had confirmed that morning that a formal investigation into Langford and Holst was underway, which was not yet public but would be. None of that was in the room right now. In the room right now, there was just the car, doing the thing it had always been capable of doing if someone would let it. Marcus came to stand beside her. "She's running clean," he said. "All systems." "Good." The press response is, he gestured at the room. "You can see." She could see. She had been in this industry long enough to know the difference between polite enthusiasm and genuine response, and what was in this room was genuine. "Nathan texted," Marcus said. She looked at him. He saw the technical documentation release online. He said, Marcus checked his phone. He said, "The Cascade spec reads right. Good launch." He looked up. "That's it. That's the whole message." Vivian looked at the Apex Falcon, at the crowd around it, at the journalist crouched to photograph the engine through the open hood. The engine that had waited 15 years in a digital archive under a wrong name and 21 years in a manila folder in whatever apartments Nathan Hale had moved through and was now running in public for the first time under its right name, doing exactly what it had been designed to do. She thought about what it costs a person to be good at something in a world that is not always organized around rewarding the right things. She thought about the specific loneliness of competence that goes unrecognized, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that resolves in a single vindication and leaves you whole, the ordinary kind, the kind that accumulates across years of delivering packages and working on other people's cars in a machine shop on Kercheval Avenue, carrying a folder of dated sketches because throwing it away meant agreeing with what happened, and you weren't willing to agree with what happened. She thought about what Doreen Castillo had said when Marcus finally reached her in Dearborn, standing in a supplier's parking lot on the phone, voice initially careful, and then careful in a different way, the way of someone who has spent many years being careful and is finally being asked to stop. "I kept my copies too," she had said. "I always thought someone would ask eventually. I just didn't think it would take this long. Some things take this long." That was the part nobody tells you. Not in engineering school, not in business school, not anywhere that prepares you for the specific patience required to hold on to what you know is true when the institution around you has decided it's more convenient to believe something else. Victor Langford had understood this about institutions. He had used it, deliberately, and over many years, as a tool. The people he had used it against had understood it too, in a different way, as a weight they carried and kept carrying until the morning when a delivery driver set down a hand truck in a showroom and asked a question that everyone in the room decided to laugh at. Vivian understood something now that she had not understood fully before this week, that she had inherited not just a company in need of rebuilding, but a company that had practiced for a long time the institutional habit of looking at what was convenient rather than what was true. The Regent failures, the altered records, the performance improvement plan written in language vague enough to justify any outcome. None of it had been invisible. All of it had required people to not look closely, to accept the version they were given because the alternative version was more complicated and more costly, and required asking questions that powerful people did not want asked. She did not think she was exempt from that habit. She thought about the corners she had let sit unexamined over 12 years because there was always something more urgent, always a more immediate fire. She thought about the Regent settlement and the conclusion she had been advised to let stand, and the folder of documents that had been sitting in an off-site storage box while she accepted that conclusion. She had not been complicit in what Langford had done, but she had benefited from an institution that had never examined it, and that was its own kind of debt. She was not going to be clean on the other side of this. She was going to spend the next 2 years in depositions and SEC proceedings and board restructuring conversations and whatever came from the federal investigation. And some of it was going to be ugly, and some of it was going to be public, and none of it was going to be as simple as the launch happening in front of her right now. She knew this about herself. She had a tendency, under pressure, to manage situations toward the best available outcome and call that outcome good enough. The work ahead of her required something different. It required sitting with what was true even when the true thing was inconvenient to the company she was responsible for, and a version of herself she would rather not examine. She thought she could do it. She wasn't certain, but she thought so. Marcus said something she didn't fully catch. She looked at him. "Sorry. I said the Channel 7 reporter wants a comment on the technical documentation attribution, the Hale series credit. She's asking about the context." Vivian looked at the reporter near the edge of the crowd, a woman in her 30s with a recorder and the alert, slightly combative posture of someone who has done her research and has questions. "I'll talk to her," Vivian said. She crossed the showroom floor. The crowd moved around the car, around the engine, around the thing that had been built by a 29-year-old in a department that no longer existed and had spent 21 years living under a wrong name. The Apex Falcon's idol was steady and low at the front of the room, the sound she had come to know over the past 5 days. Composed and certain and entirely itself, indifferent to who got the credit, just doing what it was designed to do. On the Monday after the launch, Nathan Hale came back to the Sterling building for the first time without a delivery hand truck. He wore the same kind of clothes. He did not carry a briefcase or a folder. He came through the front entrance and gave his name to the receptionist and clipped on his visitor badge, the one that said consultant this time, not delivery, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor where the technical apprenticeship offices were, which currently consisted of 2 rooms with outdated equipment and a whiteboard that someone had written "Tues Training, 2 p.m. on" in marker and not erased, which told him everything he needed to know about the program's current state. He stood in the doorway of the larger room for a moment, looking at it. It was going to need work. The equipment was inadequate. The curriculum materials he'd reviewed were generic to the point of uselessness, and the room itself had the unloved quality of a space that people pass through without caring whether it served its purpose. There was a lot to fix. He walked in. He set his jacket on the back of the nearest chair. He went to the whiteboard and found a marker that still worked and wrote 2 things. What is the machine trying to do? Why? He stood back and looked at what he'd written. Then he turned around and looked at the room. The equipment that needed replacing, the walls that needed something on them, the 2 windows that let in adequate light. He had a lot of work to do. That was fine. He had always done better with work in front of him than with the absence of it. He pulled out the nearest chair and sat down and began.